Welcome to Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. I'm Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. Australia is facing its most significant challenges since World War II. Geopolitical tensions are increasing, cultural self-confidence is in decline. The values which define us, freedom, democracy, egalitarianism, and sacrifice, are being put to the test. Over this special podcast series, Tony and I discuss how Australia can survive and flourish in the decades ahead. Well, hello, Tony, and g'day to all of our listeners. Great to be back for another episode of Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. As always, looking forward to our discussion today. Tony will be sharing his insights on the treaty and voice matter, the gas ban here in Victoria and what that means for Australia's energy system, and also Australia's struggling defence capabilities and what that means for the future of our nation. Tony, great to be back with you for another chat.
Dan, it's wonderful to be here. We've had a bit of a holiday, but it's nice to resume.
I'd call it a working holiday, I think,
exactly,
Tony. We've certainly not been kicking our feet up. So,
yeah.
Look, Tony, let's get into it, I reckon, with the defence issue. This is on the back of Greg Sheridan, who wrote an article recently in The Australian, and he was quite scathing of the procurement and the actual capabilities that we're investing in or not investing in, as the case is. Very briefly, Greg argues that we had the recent Australia-United States ministerial meeting, and he says that it was profoundly depressing for its lack of strategic insight and its lack of foresight in terms of getting serious about acquiring the capabilities that we need to face the challenges of our future. We'll go into a little bit of the details of what Greg says, but to start with, Tony, you've had a lot of experience on defence issues. You were a passionate advocate of making sure we're properly armed and properly secure, and you continue to be a lead advocate today. Can I get your insights and perspective on the broader defence issues that we face?
Yes, Dan, and I think that Greg is absolutely on the money. These are very dangerous times. These are the most ominous times that the West has faced since the late 1930s, and there just needs to be far more urgency about our military preparedness and our strategic awareness. Now, I absolutely appreciate that the Australian people are a peaceful people. We want to harm no one. We don't seek fights, but sometimes fights come to you. Sometimes fights come to the people who you care about. And just as we've got the Russian dictator monstering the decent people of Ukraine, whose only crime is to want to be free and independent, we've got the Chinese dictator looking lustfully at Taiwan. And just as Putin thinks that it's his mission from God, if you like, to take back what he sees as the rebel province of Ukraine into Greater Russia, the Red Emperor in Beijing sees it as his mission from whatever deity the communists believe in to take back what he sees as a rebel province, but which is, for all practical purposes, an independent country of Taiwan. Now, the trouble with dictators is that they're never satisfied. They take one place and then they decide that for their own personal glory and for national aggrandisement, they've got to take somewhere else as well. There is not a single country bordering on China that has a good relationship with China because China sees itself as the centre of the universe. It sees itself as the Middle Kingdom. The rulers in Beijing historically have seen themselves as the lords of all under heaven. And I'm afraid Marxism-Leninism has just reinforced all of that. So just as we've seen aggressive war break out in Europe, we could see aggressive war break out in our region. And it's almost inconceivable that we could or should stand aloof from that. America has given very strong commitments to Taiwan. 4 times President Biden has said, yes, America would fight for Taiwan. If America does fight for Taiwan, Australia is, I think, obliged under ANZUS to help. And even if the Americans might be hesitant, I think the Japanese would certainly fight for Taiwan because Taiwan is very much an immediate strategic interest of theirs. And America has an unbreakable alliance, an absolute commitment to defend Japan, which would become an immediate Chinese target should there be an outbreak of hostilities. So look, these are ominous circumstances, and the best way to avoid war is to be ready to fight one. The best way to preserve the peace is through strength. What we've got to do is raise the costs to Beijing of any aggression across the Taiwan Straits. But to raise the costs of aggression, we've got to be prepared to do things. And I would think that basing at least some of our submarines and fast jets in Japan would be a good thing for Australia to do. But we just need more in the way of defence muscle. We're in the process of acquiring 12 corvettes, which are really mini frigates. They virtually have no armament. And the very first and immediate thing that the Australian government should be doing, in my view, is up-arming those new corvettes with maybe helicopters, with heavier weaponry, because what's the point of having warships that can't fight? And that's the problem at the moment. So there's a lot to be done. I think it's a little embarrassing that the best we could do for Ukraine recently was 30 more Bushmasters when we've still got close to 1,000 sitting in depots here in this country. I think it's embarrassing that we still don't have the Hawkeye armoured vehicle in operational service and that we couldn't give the Ukrainians some of them. I just think we need to do more if we are to be taken seriously as a nation. And we should be taken seriously as a nation because we are the world's 12th largest economy. We're an important middle power. We are a country with universal values, with global interests, and we should have some global reach.
Why is it that we seem to struggle to get this right? Is it a sort of a procurement issue of things getting bogged down in the bureaucracy and regulation and red tape? Is it that there's a lack of strategic leadership coming out of senior levels of the federal government? It just seems that, time and time again, we're making what seems to be pretty basic errors in our defence planning. What's your perspective on why we're making these errors?
Look, it's a good question, Dan. I think there is an understandable reluctance at every level of our society to contemplate the possibility of major armed conflict. Yes, we had an involvement in Iraq and an involvement in Afghanistan, but it was pretty remote from everyone's daily life. It was something that the SAS and our commandos did, and yes, they did it well and they took casualties. But even the bulk of the armed forces were not heavily engaged. And I think we need to appreciate that just because there was no major war between countries between 1945 and recently doesn't mean that it can't ever happen again and that it can't ever happen to us. Now, we hope that it doesn't. We absolutely hope that it doesn't. As we're witnessing in Ukraine, warfare is dreadful, absolutely dreadful, particularly when you're up against an absolutely ruthless and implacable opponent. But just because it's dreadful doesn't mean that it can't happen. And the same impulses that pushed Putin into doing this dreadful thing, which has already caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, the same impulses are operating in Beijing. And we can't assume that war is something that can't happen to us. We have to be ready to play our part in preserving the peace and the freedom and the security of the wider world, as Australia always has been in the past.
Yeah.
So why is it that we find all of this difficult to grasp and to act upon? Then, of course, there's the general view in the defence bureaucracy. And again, I can understand why generals don't want to commit their troops to combat, because they, understandably enough, want to protect their troops. But in the end, the armed forces exist to fight, and we sometimes have to put them forward in order to avoid a fight.
Yeah.
And let's hope this doesn't happen, but it may be that we sometimes have to put them forward for a fight, a big fight. And I just think that there needs to be a general appreciation at every level of our society, but particularly in the defence establishment, that the armed forces are there, if necessary, to fight for our freedom, our security, our values, and the freedom, security and values that we hold in common with our important allies and partners. So it was Angus Houston who said not so long ago in connection with the Defence Posture Review that these are the most dangerous times he's seen in his lifetime. He's right, and I hope that a similar attitude is pervasive in the defence establishment. But if it were pervasive in the defence establishment, you'd think there would be much more urgency, A, to help Ukraine, B, to be of more practical assistance in our region, and C, to get more muscle into our military as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and Tony, as you and I have discussed in the past, one of the most critical elements to national security is, of course, energy security. If you can't have your own sovereign energy supplies, then you can't have an industrial base and you can't manufacture your own munitions and so forth. Your government, I think, did more than any other government in recent memory to shore up our domestic energy supplies, getting rid of the carbon tax, getting rid of the mining tax. Yeah. You attempted to repeal what is probably the most pernicious
provision. The clean energy targets.
Well, the clean energy targets and also the lawfare provision, Section 487 of federal environmental law, before it was held up in the Senate. So your government went a long way to rehabilitating our domestic resources sector. Yet today, as we speak in Victoria, a ban will come in from next year on gas being installed into new builds across the state. This comes on the back of a constitutional ban on gas development here a couple of years ago. It's going in the wrong direction. Tony, what's your assessment of what's happening?
Well, I think what the Victorian Labor government is doing is quite bizarre, absolutely bizarre. In the short term, at least, what the Victorian Labor government is doing will raise costs to consumers and, paradoxically, raise emissions, because something like 60% of Victoria's electricity still comes from brown coal, and by moving away from gas and towards brown coal produced electricity, emissions will go up, not down. But if you go and look at the Choice website, Choice, of course, being the consumer advocacy group, you'll see that the annualised costs of gas hot water, for instance, are roughly half the annualised costs of electric hot water and roughly half the emissions, because gas is half the emissions of coal-produced electricity. So it's a completely counterproductive move. It's the ultimate virtue signalling from the Andrews government, and if there's anything that's surprised me here, it's the fact that the Victorian opposition hasn't been quicker not just to criticise but to condemn and to commit to immediately repealing this should they win an election next time one's due.
Yeah, and this has also got the potential not only to affect Victorians but to destabilise the national energy system, because of course across the east coast and into South Australia and also down to Tassie, you've got the national energy market. So by further taking off gas supplies off the market, then that's going to make Victoria more dependent on New South Wales and Queensland as well to get their gas and coal through the system. And I think that where this is going is if Victoria keeps destabilising the system, my fear is that the state governments will make decisions basically to sort of renationalise their own state grids, which would be disappointing but understandable under the circumstances. Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Well, Dan, I think energy policy in this country is a slow motion train wreck, basically. We're at breakneck speed moving to close down coal-fired power because of its alleged impact on the climate without any reliable replacement. The federal government has legislated for a 43% emissions cut by 2030, and an essential component of that is 82% of our electricity coming from renewable sources, which means that wind and solar have got to go up from the current 25%, more or less, to about 70% of our electricity generation. Now, this is going to require an extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary investment and construction frenzy. Even Chris Bowen says that to get there, we've got to install 22,000 solar panels every single day and 40 large wind turbines every single month for the next seven years or so. And we've got to build at least 10,000 and perhaps 28,000 kilometres of new transmission line. This is never going to happen. It's just not going to happen. But even if it did happen, we would then need to firm all this intermittent power when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. And that means gas. The only economically feasible way and technically feasible way to firm intermittent power is gas, because gas comes on instantaneously. Coal takes quite a while to chime in, but gas is instantaneous or almost instantaneous. And yet we're demonising gas almost as much as we're demonising coal. And if you look at governments right around the country, whatever they might say, they are constantly putting obstacles in the way of new gas developments, so much so that our friends and partners, the Japanese and the South Koreans, are now gravely anxious that Australia is no longer going to be the source of energy security that it traditionally has been because of our reluctance to bring on stream new gas fields. There's the Beetaloo gas field, there's the Narrabri gas field, there's the Browse gas field. These should be up and running now, and yet they are completely tangled up in green lawfare, which no government, certainly no Labor government, seems to want to untangle. I mean, we need to slice this Gordian knot and get these gas resources on stream as quickly as is humanly possible for our own sake and also for the sake of our friends and partners.
You mentioned all of the bureaucratic red tape that's holding up these projects, and that's only going to get worse, we've seen in Western Australia the cultural heritage laws, which are holding up projects and will hold up projects, which is basically an entree to what they want to do at the federal level. And it's just the beginning of what could happen under a voice to Parliament. And we've seen recently in the debate about the voice, discussion about a treaty. The Prime Minister and also Linda Burney, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, have been frantically backtracking from their clear commitment to implement a treaty, if not in this term, then in the next term of government. It's clear that a voice to Parliament is a first step to a treaty and a necessary step to a treaty, because it would adjudicate or officiate over a treaty process. Tony, how far down this rabbit hole is this country going to go before we understand that this separatism and the path we're going down is just plain wrong?
There are some parallels, if I may say so, between energy policy and Indigenous policy, if I might use that terminology. All of us want to protect the environment and to save the planet, and all of us would like to minimise emissions. What we're realising, though, is that minimising emissions the way the Green Left want is incredibly destructive, economically destructive, and destructive for people's lifestyles in the end. And likewise, reconciliation. All of us are in favour of reconciliation. All of us want a much better deal for Aboriginal people, particularly for the 20-25% or so living in remote areas where all of the disadvantage factors are at their most severe. We all want a better deal. I think nearly all of us are happy to see acknowledgement of Indigenous people as the first Australians in the Constitution, but this voice is just so much more than that. It's about power, and of course the voice is just the first step. If you look at the Uluru Statement, it's about voice, treaty, truth. Voice, treaty, truth. And while the Prime Minister is backpedalling furiously from his commitment to all three elements of the Uluru Statement, let's never forget that the very first thing that Anthony Albanese said on election night last year, after a rather fulsome acknowledgement of country, was, "We are committed to the Uluru Statement from the heart in full." So that means voice, treaty, truth. The voice is going to entrench race in our Constitution. It's going to gum up government. It's going to reinforce the separatism that is the source of so much Indigenous dysfunction. Treaty is going to involve months and years of negotiations, not just between Indigenous people generally or their leaders and the Commonwealth government, but between states and the Commonwealth and perhaps 300 different Indigenous clans. And it's going to involve hundreds of millions, if not multiples of billions in compensation. If you look at the full Uluru documentation, not just the one-pager that people are starting to become familiar with, but the 25 pages of additional documentation, they talk about a percentage of GDP being part of the reparations that will be covered by all these treaties. So there's massive additional expense, massive additional interference with people's ordinary lives and ordinary rights, like this West Australian Heritage Act on steroids.
Yep.
And then, of course, you've got truth. Well, basically, what that means, at least as far as the Uluru authors are concerned, that means recasting Australia's history as a story of shame.
Yep.
Story of shame, of dispossession, of genocide, of evil, even, and this is the language that they use in the fuller Uluru Statement and the deliberations leading up to it.
Yep.
Now, okay, let's accept that not everything was fantastic, and some terrible things happened in the course of the settlement of Australia.
Of course.
But our story is fundamentally a good one. It has a fundamentally good story. There isn't a single Australian, black, white, whatever, who shouldn't be on balance proud of our country. I think the vast majority of Indigenous people, like the vast majority of Australians, accept that it's a great country. It's not perfect, but whatever faults we have, being racist is not one of them. We are as colourblind as any country on earth. We are as decent and as generous to people who are different as any country on earth. Let's celebrate that. Let's build on our strengths. Let's not for a second feel embarrassed or ashamed of what is one of the world's great stories.
That's right. Look, just to round out the conversation, Tony, I guess it's always a question of people, your day-to-day person is quite understandably getting on with their lives and focusing on what they need to focus on. I think slowly the penny is starting to drop that the priorities of this government may not be the priorities of your families and your small businesses on the street. I see the voice referendum as a de facto sort of referendum on the government as a result of the fact that Albanese has very personally owned this issue. But I'm also aware that most people, the day after the vote, whether it's yes or no, will just go on with their lives and basically not think about it ever again. Just interested in your perspective of the broader context for the referendum and what that might mean for the political dynamics.
Well, I think this voice referendum is really a referendum on Australia. If you think Australia is a country to be proud of, vote no to this divisive and dangerous voice. If you think that Australia is fundamentally racist, fundamentally illegitimate, sure, vote yes. But I don't think that's the majority position. Now I do know that the Yes campaign is going to do its best to morally browbeat, even intimidate people into voting yes by claiming that it's somehow racist to vote no. That's completely wrong, and all credit to wonderful Indigenous Australians like Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price for spearheading the campaign against this divisive and dangerous voice. They are living, breathing proof that Indigenous people, no less than everyone else, wants us to go forward as one, united, equal people. So as I said, I think this referendum is really, in the end, a vote about whether we like our country or dislike our country. And I've got to say, I vote no to disliking our country. I vote no to trying to upend what is the best country on earth.
Well, Tony, I can't think of a better note to end on. So, as always, thank you for your time and the generosity of your insights, and looking forward to our chat in another couple of weeks.
Thank you, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.